Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Okay. When we look at our sense of the history of Israel, we tend to be familiar with what is in the Bible. So we go from patriarchs, wandering shepherd people, up to the Exodus, up through the foundation of the kingdom under Saul and David, the history of the kingdom and its ups and downs, and then the biblical story as story sort of ends in many ways with the Babylonian captivity and the return from that. But that leaves a long period, because that took place in 538 BCE. That's several centuries of Jewish history building up to Jesus that we don't pay much attention to, because it's not talked about in the Bible, at least in terms of story. There are prophets in that period, but this is just a quick overview. When they returned from exile, the land was a part of the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus the Mede, the Persian Empire, and so they didn't have a king. So the country was essentially ruled by the priests and centralized in Jerusalem around the temple. And the Torah, as we understand it, was sort of actually the Old Testament, as we understand it, plus what we call the Apocrypha, were pretty much settled. Well, actually, the Torah was settled in that period. The rest come a little later. Then the Hellenistic period, Alexander the Great conquered that whole area. He didn't live long enough to rule, but he divided it among his generals. And then the generals fought over it for centuries, and their descendants. And so in the Hellenistic period, that's the Greek-ruled period, you had local rule by the high priest, and the high priest kind of filled the role of the king in that time. And the high priest was a vassal first under the Ptolemaic Empire, which was the descendants of Ptolemy, one of the generals, and then the Seleucid Empire from Seleucus, another general. The Septuagint, the Greek translation that became the Bible for the early church, and the full canon was established sometime in this period, probably in the 200s. And there was also a local dynasty, the Hasmoneans. We're not terribly familiar with the story of the Maccabees, but there was a character, Seleucid ruler, Antiochus IV, who liked to call himself Epiphanes, the manifestation of God, modest man, who attempted to put up a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple. That led to a revolt, which was successful. So under various leaders, political leaders who had led this revolt, they became independent. We have here the beginnings of rabbinic Judaism, because you begin to have sort of local, within villages or towns, councils that are studying the law and laying down the law for people. But it was ultimately run by the Sanhedrin, which was not an elected body, but it was a body of religious leaders, and a guy called the Nasi, who was sort of the chief interpreter of the law. Think about the head Ayatollah in Iran. Works with the council, but you've got this religious leader who is actually more powerful than the priests in the temple. And then there were various attempts to reconquer Judah. And in 64 BCE, Pompey the Great, a Roman general, we don't know as much hear about him as much as we do Julius Caesar, but he and Julius Caesar were sort of equal and opposite opponents for leadership as the Roman Republic fell apart, and Caesar wound up being triumphant. And it's at this time that King Herod comes in. Herod was not purely Jewish, which means that he was looked down upon a lot by the Jewish people, but he was one of the richest men in the ancient world. Before this became politically sensitive, I used to say that Herod the Great was the Donald Trump of the ancient world. He was very rich. He built a lot of things. When he rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, he covered it in gold leaf. He didn't put his name on it, but still, you know, a larger than life character. And then in the Roman period, you know, this is where we've got the life of Jesus, but also there were various attempts to throw off Roman rule, and you've got to imagine, you know, some tiny little third world country going up against, you know, the American army or Chinese or Russian or whatever. Every revolt was put down, but there was a major revolt between 63 and 70, which ended with the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. The political parties that we hear about in the New Testament, the Sadducees, any party that was tied to the temple just disappeared because you no longer had a temple. And there was a guy named Yohanan ben Zakkai, and he got permission from the Romans to establish a community at a place called Jamnia, and the Pharisees were the continuing party. And under Yohanan, rabbinic Judaism as it developed, a Judaism that could survive without the temple, was developed. And then in 135, there was a guy named Bar Kokhba, that means son of the star, who led a final revolt against the Romans. And this time they got me. And they leveled Jerusalem and built a whole new city on top of it. Built a temple to Jupiter on the former site of the Jerusalem temple. One of the things that happened in Judaism that is important for us is because of the negative effects of people receiving new revelations from God. The idea being, God has told me that now is the time and we're going to throw off the Roman rule. Well, they saw what that could do. And so there is a turn away from new revelations, which is a part of the split between the Jewish community and the growing Christian community. And this is summed up in a Jewish story, that there is an argument going on at Jamnia over the ritual purification of an oven. And a young rabbi stands up and gives an argument, and everybody agrees that it's not a bad idea, but because Jewish law, as they're using it now, is case law, there's no precedent. And so the rabbi says, well, will you accept the testimony of a tree? And he points out the window, and there's a tree out there that uproots itself and goes over and plants itself in there. You know, and remember, If you had the faith of a mustard seed, you could say to this tree, and so on. And the rabbis are just outraged. Who has ever heard of a tree being granted voice in a rabbinic council? So the guy says, will you accept the testimony of the wall? And he points to the wall, and there's an earthquake, and a big crack comes down the wall. And it's the same thing. Who's ever heard of a wall thing? And finally, he says, will you accept a voice from heaven? And God speaks, and God says, the kid is right. Listen to him. And at that, the oldest rabbi there, Rabbi Eliezer, says, since the beginning, it has always been, let the majority rule. And so they disavow God's voice. Now, and the story goes later on that one of the rabbis is wandering through the desert and bumps into the prophet Elijah. Elijah is always there to come back since he went up to heaven. And he says, when that happened, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, say? And Elijah says he laughed and said, my sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me. But what this is a mark of, because of, this picture that you've got up there is, that's interesting, is a picture of the triumph in Rome after the destruction of the temple at the end of the First Roman-Jewish War. You can see the menorah from the temple being carried. This is from the Arch of Titus. Because they've seen what these revelations can lead to, these new ideas, thinking that God is telling you now's the time, they've turned away from them. So that's just a little bit of history to give you a sense of what's going on. The other thing, because if you look at all of the different historical things going on, being governed by the Persians and the Greeks, and then finally the Romans, it's been really hard on poor little Israel. They have been under subjection, and they can look back to a sort of Camelot period under King David. That's the way the story goes. And they keep hoping that God's going to give that back to them, and it never happens. So the idea that it's going to take a major cataclysm to fix things is perfectly natural. So let's go on. So, okay. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. Another angel with a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given a great quantity of incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar that is before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Now the seven angels who had the seven trumpets made ready to blow them. So, back to Bob's question about the half an hour, there's a sense of preparation going on here. We're building up to something that's going to happen. I've got here what's called the Little Apocalypse, which is out of Matthew chapter 24 and 25. And we'll just read a little of it, but this is, let us say, an earlier apocalypse. This is attributed to Jesus. It comes out of that material that is common to Matthew and Luke, doesn't appear in Mark or John. It's that scene where they're coming out of the temple. His disciples are really impressed by the temple. The Herod Tower, the gold-covered temple. And he says, I tell you, not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. And then when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, now you got to understand, if you're sitting on the Mount of Olives, you've got Jerusalem laid out in front of you across the valley. So you're not looking at the temple like looking up at something big, you're looking down on it. And you're seeing all of that laid out there. And when Herod redid his temple complex, it takes up an incredible space out of the city, the old city of Jerusalem. It was kind of made for tourists to come and visit the temple. So he's sitting up there, they're looking down on him. When will this be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus says, beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Don't be alarmed, but for the end is not yet. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, earthquakes. But all this is but the beginning of the birth pain. Then they will hand you over to be tortured and will put you to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of my name. So then down in 15, when you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, as was spoken of by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, helpful note. That desolating sacrilege, probably in Daniel, refers to Antiochus Epiphanes and wanting to put a pagan statue in the Jerusalem temple. And he's talking about how bad the time is going to be. There'll be great suffering. And if those days had not been cut short, no one would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, these days will be cut short. And I think you're going to get a reflection of a sort of parallel idea coming up as the trumpets are blown. So, they say, look, the Messiah's here, there, don't believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes from the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Okay, we'll get into the vulture imagery. It used to say eagles, but Middle Eastern eagles are really vultures. Sun will be darkened, moon will not give its light, stars will fall from heaven, powers of heaven will be shaken. And then we have the trumpet call, and he'll gather his elect from the four winds. All right, so we've been through the half an hour. An angel with the 11 trumpets who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. The trumpet is a symbol of judgment in the Old Testament, and we'll get some references to that. This is a sign that this is God acting through the angels, because God is giving them these trumpets to blow, and as each trumpet is blown, something happens. And another angel with a golden censer came and stood at the altar. Now, when we think of a censer, we think of those brass pots on chains that people swing like this. Well, they didn't do that in the ancient world. This is a censer over to the side in the picture. It was something that sat on something. And the whole question of the altar and stood at the altar that is before the throne, the golden altar. Is this the same altar that the martyrs are under? We don't know. I mean, it could be that you've got this one altar, but if you think back to the temple in Jerusalem, there was an altar of sacrifice and there was an altar of incense. And the idea was that, you were doing stuff on the altar of sacrifice with burning animals and all of this. So you'd have a separate one for incense to go up before that. The idea of the the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Again and again and again in the Old Testament, when they talk about sacrifice, like here in Exodus, this is just one example, turn the whole ram into smoke on the altar, burn it all up. It is a burnt offering to the Lord. It is a pleasing odor, an offering by fire to the Lord. And there was a sense in the Old Testament that what God received from the sacrifice was the smell. That was what God partook of, because God's not going to sit down and eat a leg off of an ox or something. So we have here, by this time, there is no longer any sacrifice at the Jerusalem temple. The Christian faith is developing, in its earliest years, and you have examples of Paul going to the temple and sacrificing. But we have to have a religion without sacrifice. So in some sense, the smoke of the incense is taking the place of the smoke from the offered animal. But we also have the sense that instead of the sacrificial animal on the altar, you have the prayers of the saints being offered out, the martyrs, those who have died. So, and you'll notice that we've had 7 seals. We're about to have 7 trumpets. Once we have the 7 trumpets, we have 7 bowls with God's wrath. And the trumpets, we'll see, will mirror the plagues of Egypt. And you remember that in the story of the Exodus, there are all of these plagues, darkness, and the river turned to blood, and flies, and cattle disease, and all of this that are brought upon the Egyptians to try to force the Pharaoh to let God's people go free. Let's go back and we'll look at the 7 angels. In Jewish thought, there was a fairly well-developed thing of the angels of the presence. Some of these names are familiar to us in the book of Tobit. I am Raphael, one of the 7 angels who stand ready and enter before the glory of the Lord. And then in Luke, right at the beginning, the story of John the Baptist, his birth, angel replied, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God. And I've been sent to speak to you and bring you this good news. Well, there are extra biblical things that list these 7 angels: Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, Salathiel, Uriel, Rachiel, and Yehudiel. These are the 7, as Christian iconography developed, these are the 7 archangels. But here in the Revelation, these angels who stand in the presence of God are the ones given the trumpet. And throughout the Old Testament, trumpets are used as a sign of judgment. Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is near, and the day of the Lord is the day of judgment. In the Jewish festivals, the Day of Atonement, where people fast for their sins, begins with the blowing of a shofar, a ram's horn trumpet. The trumpet is a symbol of judgment. Okay. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were hurled to the earth. And 1/3 of the earth was burned up, 1/3 of the trees, and all the green grass. Second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. 1/3 of the sea became blood, 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. Third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. 1/3 of the waters became wormwood, and many died from the water because it was made bitter. Fourth angel blew his trumpet, and 1/3 of the sun was struck, and 1/3 of the moon, and 1/3 of the stars, so that 1/3 of their light was darkened. 1/3 of the day was kept from shining, and likewise the night. Then I looked and heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew in mid-heaven, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, at the blasts of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow. Okay. So, first angel blew his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were hurled to the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees, and all the green grass. Now, all of this, we have this third being destroyed. And to go back to that Matthew thing, and I don't know that, John was reading this, but the idea that that this stuff that's being done for judgment is limited. In Matthew, the days had not been cut short; everything would have been destroyed. Here, the judgment is not it's not destroying everything, but it's destroying a significant part of it. This is reminiscent of the seventh plague of Egypt. Moses stretched out his staff toward the heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire came down on the earth. And the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. There was hail with fire flashing continually in the midst of it, such heavy hail as had never fallen on all the land of Egypt. The hail struck down everything that was in the open field throughout all the land of Egypt, human and animal. The hail also struck down all the plants of the field and shattered every tree of the field. And it goes on and say, but not where the Jews were living. And so what is seen to be in Jewish later understanding of this is probably originally meant to be a description of a really massive thunderstorm, and that the fire flashing continually is lightning. But since they use the language of fire there, the Jewish interpretation, and you see this in the Apocrypha and Wisdom, is that there was fire, flames. For the ungodly, refusing to know you, were flogged by the strength of your arm, pursued by unusual rains and hail and relentless storms, and utterly consumed by fire. For most incredible of all, in water, which quenches all things, the fire had still greater effect. So if you have this story of fire in the midst of rain, what are you going to do? Well, it's a big miracle that there's fire in the midst of rain. And so this, the trumpet of judgment blows, and all of this comes down. Now, if we look back to the story of the Exodus and the 8 plagues on the Egyptians, there is a thing that confuses people when they read it, because periodically, as the plagues are falling on them, Pharaoh will get ready to let the people of God go. But then it says, but God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he wouldn't let them go. And people will say, well, that doesn't sound like a good thing. God causing all this suffering and hardening Pharaoh's heart. But if you think about it, at least the way that I was taught, first of all, to the Egyptians, Pharaoh is a god. And so on one level, the story of the Exodus is a story of a contest between two gods, or let us say two supposed gods. And there's a theme that appears sort of throughout Jewish thought. It gets stronger and stronger as time goes on, that you've got God, and then you've got the pagan gods, which are idols. And you get these sort of satires in the prophets of a guy goes out and he cuts down a tree, and he takes the tree home, and with part of it, he cooks his supper, but the rest of it, he carves into an idol, and he bows down, he eats his supper, then he goes out and bows down and worships to the idol. And so we begin to see more and more that the gods of the nations are not to be seen as real gods. Pharaoh, the reason for hardening his heart is to show who's in control, who's running things. So I think keeping in mind the story of the Exodus in the background as we look at the Revelation, that the faithful or the Jewish people were oppressed by a king who thought of himself as taking the place of God. And there you have a nation, so God can come in and deliver the Jews from there, and he's got a place to take them to, the promised land. But now, and looking at Jewish history, it's not just a nation that is under control of the one who says he's a god and is oppressing the Jewish people. It's everywhere. The Roman Empire is all around you. The Greek Empire was all around you. The Persian and Egyptian empires had you surrounded. So it's not like there is a place that you can go to. You can't get on a bus and go to paradise and get away from the Romans. So it is the whole world system, and in this case in particular, the Roman system, that is being challenged here. And it is, I think, not quite as clearly a contest here, because they're really wanting to emphasize the sovereignty and the power of God. But God is casting once again the plagues of Egypt over the new Egypt, the new Babylonians, the Romans. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. And here we have the first plague in Egypt. And the first plague in Egypt was Moses stretched out his hands over the waters of Egypt, and they were turned into blood. And that happened everywhere except where the Jews were living. That's God's first sign. And here it goes beyond the river being turned into blood. It's the sea that's being turned into blood. You've got the whole, whatever surrounds the whole creation is affected here. And the great mountain, I mean, there are lots of different references to mountains, but we've encountered first Enoch before, and there is a reference in a couple of chapters there. I saw there 7 stars like great burning mountains, and there I saw 7 stars of the heaven bound together in it like great mountains and burning with fire. That seems a bit of a stretch, but it's the same phrase. You've got this first plague affecting even more, but you've also got, it's a sort of second part of the new first plague. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch. So you've got a mountain, you've got a star, and it fell on a third of the rivers. Now it's kind of hard to imagine the geography of this, a star falling on a third of the rivers, but let's go with it. And on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many died from the water because it was bitter. So we've got that first thing there. We've also got, and how are you fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn? How are you cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low? Now, later, Christian interpreters would say that this is a story of the fall of Satan, but it's for Isaiah, it was probably more likely a sort of remark on the death of the king of Babylon. You thought you were so hot. Well, saw your funeral on TV. but the falling of this, the idea of the falling star. And in Exodus, there's a story of coming to a place called Mara. Mara means bitter. And there's water there that is poisonous, and Moses throws a stick out and purifies the water, and the people are allowed to drink. Well, this is a reversal of that miracle of the Exodus, because the waters become Mara. They become bitter. And the idea of using wormwood, Jeremiah and other places, I am feeding this people with wormwood and giving them poisonous water to drink, which is a punishment. So we're working our way through the plagues of Egypt. We are hopefully getting ready for a new Exodus. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars. So that a third of their light was darkened, and a third of the day was kept from shining, and likewise the night. That does not mean that you had, say, 3 hours of darkness and then the rest of the night was normal. It's, think of a dimmer turned down a third. So here's the ninth plague. I'm sorry, there were 10 plagues of Egypt, not 8. The ninth plague, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven so that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was dense darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. People couldn't see one another, and for 3 days they could not move from where they were. But all the Israelites had light. And so we have this plague over Egypt. The idea of this kind of darkness, we can see in Amos and Joel, as God says, I'll make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. A sign of the coming of judgment. So tying in these two ideas together, we're building up to judgment. Then I looked and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew in mid-heaven. Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, the blast of the other trumpets that the 3 angels are about to blow. Well, we clean things up in translations. Then I looked and I heard a vulture crying with a loud voice, heard a buzzard crying with a loud voice as it flew in mid-heaven. And the vulture is a sign of judgment. From Hosea, set the trumpet to your lips. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have broken my covenant and transgressed my law. And why is the vulture a sign of judgment? Well, there are going to be some corpses lying around. We're going to be feeding the vultures. Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth at the blast of the other. And there are 3 woes, and there are 3 trumpets that the 3 angels are about to blow. And so we'll be moving into a sort of whole new level of judgment. We're a little early today, but this is as far as I've gotten in prepping. But, is this after Jesus' death? Yeah. Yes, this is, well, if you think that Jesus was crucified, somewhere between, let's say, 30 and 33 AD. The Jerusalem temple is destroyed in 70. We don't have an exact date on this, but for a variety of reasons, scholars think this was probably written in the 90s or after the turn of the century. But in that period, there was something of a persecution that went on around then, and they think that this might have been written initially in response to that. Well, and it's it's a different kind of persecution. But Jewish people, in order to, you know, and you can see this in other groups, but any group that wants to survive, to keep its own customs in the midst of a larger culture, has to stand apart from that culture in some way, in order to preserve itself. And sometimes Jewish people have done that by living apart. Sometimes they've been forced to live apart. Sometimes they've chosen to live apart so that they can preserve their culture. And so, for example, there is a very conservative Jewish group in Wilmington as part of a national group called Chabad. And they actually bought Anthony and Ann Lee's old store on Market Street, and that's their house of worship. But their rabbi and some of the other people in the community live not far from there, because under Jewish law, you can only walk so far on the Sabbath. And so they're within a block, or living within a block or so they can legally walk there on the Sabbath. But there's a community there. And anytime anybody lives in a separate community, other people are going to be suspicious of them. You know, what are they doing over there? You know, yeah. Anti-Semitism. Yeah. Yeah. And that has intensified over the centuries. And in fact, 20th century anti-Semitism is, while it draws on older models, it's sort of a new thing, because they've mixed pseudoscience into it, and pseudo history, I mean, all sorts of things. But back then, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, the Romans looked down on the Jews because they were allowed to have a privileged position in the empire. Jews could not be drafted into the army because they'd only fight 6 days out of the week, you know, and if there was a battle on the Sabbath, you know, well, let's see y'all tomorrow, you know. And their dietary rules, their ritual purification rules, there were, and so they were viewed as superstitious. They didn't worship the Roman gods, so they weren't patriotic. And yet here they have this privileged position. And the same thing was done for the Christians, the early Christians. They were viewed as outsiders, you know. This is a religion of women and slaves, they said. They were viewed as atheistic because they didn't worship the gods, immoral. So let's talk about loving one another. What are they getting up to? Cannibals. They eat they don't believe in our gods, but they eat their God. So outsiders tend to be viewed with suspicion, and people will say the worst things about them. I mean, if you think about every non-British immigrant group in America has been viewed as lazy, diseased, having wrong beliefs. I mean, there was an interesting book written back in the 80s or 90s called How the Irish Became White. And you think it took a few generations to go from bars that had signs that said no Irish or dogs allowed, no Irish need apply, and Italians, Poles, any kind of Jewish immigrant. And now people, what is it they say about Mexicans coming over the border? They're dishonest, they're violent, they're diseased. They're going to bring all of this to. There you get a lot of what's going on. Okay. Any other comments or thoughts?
Revelation that makes it so much clearer.
Yeah.
Don't maybe comparison, but you
Well, again, remember that these are people who would probably have all, these are the basic stories they have in the back of their minds when they're thinking about their faith. And so we keep in mind, for example, the church year. So everybody knows Jesus was born on December 25th. Well, maybe not, but we celebrate it then. So let's get a birthday card for Jesus for December 25th. And after that, we go into Epiphany. And after that, we go into Lent. And after that, we go into Easter. And we do this every year. And it becomes a part of our way of thinking about how life is structured and all of that. So they would have had other stories that were big. And so, for example, also the comparison of the Exodus, if you come to the Easter Vigil uses a lot of symbolism from the story of the Exodus because it is our Passover, not through the waters of the Red Sea, but through the waters of baptism. But we're taking one story and applying it to it. Okay.
Detail temple in Jupiter being built on the ruins of the temple. Ruins of the temple that was destroyed in 70.
Yeah, 70. Yeah. What?
Solomon's.
Well, no. Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. It was rebuilt under Ezra and Nehemiah. And so the first temple was from Solomon through the Babylonian captivity. The second temple, and they like to say the second temple was from the end of the Babylonian captivity to the destruction by the Romans. But I think you've really got to think of it as Herod's temple being kind of a third temple, because I don't know whether they tore it all down and rebuilt it, but it was a really heavy remodeling. That's right. Yeah. Slap a coat of gold leaf on that thing. No. If you go to Jerusalem, on the site of where the Jerusalem temple was, there is what's called the Dome of the Rock. If you look at a picture of Jerusalem, you'll see this building that's got a big gold dome, and that was built by Muslims because a part of the Muslim story is that the Quran was dictated to Muhammad by Allah, and that he wrote it down in a place called the Well of Souls, which is a cave on the Temple Mount. And they built the Dome of the Rock over that cave. And then off to the side is one of the oldest mosques in the Muslim world, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so those are basically the two buildings on the Temple Mount. But no, the Romans just wiped it all out. There are ultra-Orthodox Jews who want to tear down the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the temple. And in fact, if you go to visit the what's called the Haram al-Sharif, the noble enclosure, the Temple Mount, as you go up the ramp, they have a big ramp you go up. There's a little display off to the side, and usually some people there to explain it, of what the new temple will look like when they finally get to do it. And the people from this group, twice a day under armed guard, walk around the temple precincts to sort of lay claim to it. But if you can imagine, I can't remember, the Vatican was built, St. Peter's was built on the site of I think an earlier temple. And if say some very conservative Italians wanted to tear down St. Peter's and rebuild a pagan temple on the site, there would probably be some objections. So I don't think we're going to have a new temple anytime soon. So, anything else? Yeah.